This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Beginning today's show is part of a Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode with Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken as they discuss crappie and the management of them in Kansas. Kansas Forest Service Southwest Community and Rural District Forester John Klempa keeps the show rolling as he talks about windbreaks and what options landowners have when it comes to establishing one. Mike Brouk, K-State Dairy Specialist, ends the show looking at 2025 data from the Central Milk Marketing Order, which shows Kansas producers continue to make progress. That and more is coming up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Tuesday show with part of a Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode from K-State's Drew Ricketts and Joe Gerken as they discuss crappie.
One of the first activities I like to do outside every spring is go out and crappie fish. And so, there's opportunities to do that throughout the winter as well. But springtime, it just feels a little different, right? And so we're at that water temperature where they're starting to pre-spawn. You're starting to catch quite a few of them. So thought we could chat about crappie and ponds specifically today.
So when we're crappie fishing, how is crappie fishing maybe a little bit different from some of the other species that we often target in Kansas?
Yeah, one of the big things is it starts earlier. And so, crappie fishing is one of the first things that we get to do every year. And so that's a big part of it. And then the behavior of the animals as well. And so the fish like to school up. And so, if you find a crappie, you can generally find more than one crappie in that location as well. And finding the depth that they're at, the presentation, once you kind of hone in on that, you're going to start to go back to those same spots, and at least for that day, oftentimes be able to catch a lot of crappie. And so they move around. They're nomadic quite a bit, but, we're fishing for them a little bit earlier than other species, and the way that we fish for them is going to change as that water temperature increases a little bit throughout the spring. So lots of fun opportunities that we see with the early, relatively cooler water. High 50s, low 60s is when we start to see, quite a bit of that pre-spawn crappie action.
Very cool. So as it warms up a little bit, once we get into the low 60s and then high 60s and low 70s, what starts to happen there? How's it change?
Yeah, pre-spawn is when that's the high 50s, and that's when the fish start to move. They're over the winter. They're in deeper, schools, tight schools around structure generally. And when it starts to get in the higher 50s, they start to do what we call the pre-spawn. So they're going to move from those deep pools up, somewhere around 8 feet deep. And kind of hang out there. They're still packed pretty well in schools. But the males, once we start to get around 60 degrees, the males are going to start to make some nests. And they're going to be, actively feeding in this time, pre-spawn, trying to put on some weight so that the females can produce the eggs and the males can defend the nests. And so they're going to be aggressive in that pre-spawn. Once that transitions to higher 60s, we start to warm up a little bit more. We're going to see them getting into really shallow habitat, 3 or 4 feet deep. You're going to be able to catch them really close to shore. They're still feeding a little bit, but a lot of the fish we're catching then are going to be the males. And so males are really aggressive around the nests that they make, and a lot of times they're biting your lure because you got too close to their offspring, right? So not necessarily trying to eat, but those kind of temperatures, that's kind of that spawn harvest that we would see. The really big peak before, like I said, the low 60s or so, we're starting to see they're reproducing. You'll catch quite a few of them because they're trying to actively feed, and then a little bit warmer than that, and the males start to bite quite a bit.
Very cool. So if we think about crappie nesting, do they create kind of a bowl like a lot of other panfish do that they would sit in and defend, or I guess I've never seen that before. I'd never realized that crappie had that kind of behavior.
When we think about bluegill are perfect of what you're describing. So if you go out to a pond and you look around the edges in another month or so, you're going to see lots of almost like UFO crop circles, perfect circles that they have made underneath the surface of the pond there, and so relatively shallow, and you're going to find one male kind of hanging out and protecting that area. Crappie do similar things, but it's not one male per nest. They kind of make like loose schools.
Okay.
So they're all kind of hanging out kind of together. They're protecting their own little part of a bigger community type nest. And so they're still in a school. It's just they're not individual like the bluegill would be, but they're not as tight of a school as we would have seen over the winter. And so kind of somewhere in between those two groups.
If we're not thinking necessarily about the spawn, what sort of habitat do we need to target when we're fishing for them?
Yeah, so they really like structure, and so crappie are going to be found around, old trees, old stumps. They're going to like that kind of structure. If that's not available, or there's so many crappie that maybe they're kind of, pushed out of those areas, they'll start going to vegetation, and so fishing for them around, cattails or submerged vegetation that you might have, they'll like those areas as well. And so you'll find, in a barren pond, they'll find anything they can, a little rock that doesn't seem very big. If that's all that it's around, that's where all the crappie will be. And so they tend to really like structure. After the spawn, that's what they're going to do. And so they're going to come up shallow until the water temperature gets in the low 70s. They complete their spawn. That's generally somewhere around the middle of May in our area. And then they move back, not as deep as they were, not 15 or 20 feet deep like they will be in the winter, but they move back to a little bit deeper habitat. They'll be somewhere in that 8 to 10 feet deep in most ponds or reservoirs later in the summer, and they'll kind of hang out there around structure for most of the summer till they move a little bit deeper in the wintertime.
So is a crappie, or do we have different species of them, or what's that look like?
There are two main crappie species that we have. So there's a black crappie and a white crappie, and they look a little bit different, but their behavior is really different. So it's important that you know what you got. White crappie, like their name suggests, they're lighter in color. They tend to have bands on them, so they'll have little black bands that are vertical, go up and down, and then they look elongated. But that's hard to tell unless you have them right next to a black crappie, right? And so in science, a lot of times we like to find things that we can count instead of just color. And so one of the things that I teach people, when you look at their dorsal spines or their dorsal fin, there's going to be hard structures, and those are called spines. And on a white crappie, there's 5 to 6 hard spines, and on a black crappie, there's 7 or 8. And so that's something every single time, regardless of whether it's a sunny day, it's a cool day, you have other crappie to compare it to, you can count those numbers, and that's a definitive way to figure out what kind of crappie you have, right? Black crappie are the other kind. They tend to be darker. They have random spots all over their body. 7 to 8 spines on that dorsal fin. That's the thing I want you to remember. Count those number of spines. And they have a rounder body. But again, some of those characteristics are hard to consider if you don't have a white crappie and a black crappie right next to each other. Right?
Sure. If we're thinking about having crappie in a pond, what are the characteristics of the pond that we need to have in order to be thinking about putting crappie in?
Yeah, I think a lot of people love to go crappie fishing, and so it's something that pops into our mind. Hey, we want to have crappie in our pond, and understanding you can do that, but what's likely to happen most of the time is you're going to end up with a whole bunch of 4-inch crappie and nothing else in your pond, right? We want to have something like 15 acres, right? Ideally, when we get around that number, it gives us enough different habitats that there are other areas where these crappie can go. Crappie tend to have really boom and bust years. So when they have a really good recruitment, they have a lot of offspring. They have really, really high recruitment. They have a lot of offspring. And so that can be something that, hey, these numbers are really, really high. A large reservoir or a large lake that 15 acres can handle that, a small pond can't, right? And even 1 year of that can decimate the food web enough that all of your population crashes. So really, really big, lots of habitat. And then ideally, you'd want there to be some really aggressive predators in that pond or lake that you have. And so things like stripers and walleyes can really help to keep those crappie in check, right? So it's really important that you think about how they're going to reproduce if you're going to add them to your pond.
So if we think about, if we are going to stock them in a pond, we want a big pond, like you said, with lots of different kinds of habitat.
Yeah.
Would we want to stock the crappie at the same time as we stock the other fish species, or would we want to wait and let things get established? I know, like with bluegill, would we put bluegill in and then let them grow for a year or something and then put bass in later?
Yep. So you want your forage base to be in there for a year. And so what you're describing, you're going to add generally fathead minnows and bluegill. You're going to let them reproduce, recruit for a year, and they're going to make basically a smorgasbord for when you put those predators in there,
Sure.
right? If we're trying to grow crappie in our pond, we need to think about, do we want to have big bass, or do we want the bass to be stunted so that they're not eating the crappie, right? I mean, it kind of comes down to what's the goal. If you're stocking crappie in your pond, you probably want to have a crappie fishery where you have bigger crappie. And so you'd want to allow the crappie to get established, and then probably put in some smaller bass is what you would do if you're going to do that could eat some of those smaller crappie. But you wouldn't want to let them get bigger, the bass to get bigger than 15 inches or so, or they're going to start to eat some of those bigger crappie. It's really hard, though, to manage crappie with just bass. And so all of these things, they're rules of thumb for bluegill, and they work really well for that. You're going to have to add harvest in with crappie just because there's so many of them in your pond.
Sure.
And it's going to be a lot of harvest. You're going to have to really like crappie fishing. I mean, something like 50 plus pounds a year that you're going to have to harvest out of that pond. And most of those are going to be on the smaller side of the crappie, right? And so if you want to keep up with it, you're going to have to manage it in multiple ways. It's incredibly hard to do. Not saying it can't be done, but you have to really want crappie in your pond in order to stock them in it.
Once again, that was K-State's Joe Gerken, joined by Drew Ricketts, with part of their Fins, Fur, and Feathers podcast episode. If you'd like to hear the full episode on crappie, you can follow the link in today's show notes on agtoday.net, or search for Fins, Fur, and Feathers on your favorite podcast platform. If you're just wanting to learn more about wildlife, you can do that by checking out K-State Wildlife Extension's page, which is wildlife.k-state.edu. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but stick around because we have more for you up ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show discussing windbreaks with Kansas Forest Service Southwest Community and Rural District Forester John Klempa. John, thanks for joining us today.
Good morning, Shelby. Great to be here.
John, as we're thinking about windbreaks and eventually discussing how they get set up and established, what is the purpose of a windbreak?
Well, there's not a single purpose. There's plenty of purposes. One of the main ones we use out here is to protect people's homes, and that gives them energy efficiency. It allows the kids to stay in the yard without being blown away. Some of the other things we use them for are field windbreaks, so we don't have a repeat of the dirty 30s. We use them for livestock protection. A lot of times people use them for nothing more than aesthetics and wildlife, so that they have those out there on their landscape.
What do you see of the process of getting maybe a windbreak established?
You really need to get a hold of us early. I mean, as soon as you decide you want to get, say, a house built and you already have somebody staking out the footprint for the house, get a hold of us to get the footprint for the windbreak, because spacing is always a big concern. People like to put their houses as far away from the road as they can. And unfortunately, sometimes they'll put that right up against the back property line, and they leave themselves no room for trees. And by the time they call us and they've got the house built, there's just no place to put the windbreak in. And so plan early.
What does the Kansas Forest Service help landowners and homeowners with when it comes to establishing a windbreak?
Well, most of the time we don't have our own money for it, so they will go to either the conservation district for the county they're in or the NRCS office, and the NRCS office will contact us, and we will go out and discuss with the landowner what they want to do, how they want to do it, and if there's any tweaking we need to do to their plan, then we'll do that. But we then come back, we check their soil type where they want to do it, because they may have an idea of what kind of species they want to put in, but it may not work with the type of soil they have. So we don't want to plant somebody's trees in there that aren't going to last. We want to put the right tree in the right place. And so we check the soil type against the species, and then we draw up the plan for them, and they can run with it from there.
What are some different species you see being used for windbreaks?
Okay, I'm going to say a dirty word here. but a lot of times it's eastern red cedar. And that provides the density that we need to stop that cold winter wind and the snow from blowing into your house. One alternative we have out here in the western part of the state is Rocky Mountain juniper, which is a close cousin to eastern red cedar. It does look a little better. It doesn't really get brown in the wintertime when it gets dry. It stays a nice aqua green blue. Doesn't quite get as tall, but it gets tall enough. But it's all about that density. You need the density to stop the wind, and that's what we're trying to do. It does, of course, change across the spectrum of the state. As you move west, we have fewer species we can use, obviously, because of the moisture that we don't have. So we use bur oak, lacebark elm, hackberry, a lot of times as the deciduous component. Pinyon pine, ponderosa pine are the main pines we'll use. Sometimes if the soil type is right, we can use southwest white pine and put those in. And red buds and crab apples, if they like a flowering tree to put in there. That's not as tall as some of the oaks, but it brings those flowers in the springtime, and everybody likes to look at that.
You mentioned eastern red cedar trees, and often when we talk about them, we do talk about cutting them down and them being a problem. And so for homeowners who maybe that is the best tree for them, is there extra management they need to be doing, or what does that look like for them?
Eastern red cedar is a native tree to Kansas. It was here before we were. The only thing, it was kept in check by fire. And now we're keeping fire in check, so the trees are growing more. So if we just have a good fire management scheme for the property around the windbreaks, then you just don't see the escape like that if you have a good fire management program.
You've mentioned density a few times of that's really the big component of a windbreak being beneficial or useful. And so how dense, how close are those trees are we making these windbreaks in Kansas, and does it shift across the state?
It does shift across the state. Over here, we use them, we spread them out a little bit more because that gives each individual tree in the windbreak more ground from which to draw water and nutrients and stuff like that. Back east, yeah, you put them a little closer so they have the moisture and everything they need back there. So we do spread them out a little bit more over here. The deciduous trees, we will plant anytime from maybe 20 to 25 feet apart because these are going to be big trees. And I know sometimes I've seen landowners' eyes light up when you put this tiny little twig in the ground and the next one isn't for another 25 feet. And they're like, why are these so far apart? And you just remind them that they're not planting that twig. They're planting that mature tree. And it's always nice to have a mature tree somewhere around that you can point to and say, that's the tree you're planting, is that big one over there. Whatever your particular plan is, the density may change because if you're putting it around your house or your livestock that you're trying to protect, you want to have greater density. You want to stop that wind. You want to stop that snow. You don't want to let it through. But if we're doing a field windbreak where you want to have the snow come through, slow down, and drop onto the field so you have that moisture, you want to lighten up on the density so that that wind does come through with some of that snow and drop the snow onto the field. And then in the spring, of course, it melts and it goes into the field. So it's all about the plan, what you're actually doing with it, your objective.
What's the life cycle or the lifespan commonly of windbreaks?
If they're properly taken care of, you can easily get them a minimum of 80 years to even more. I haven't gotten that far yet, so I can't say I've seen this one go from 0 to 80, but yeah, you can easily get them 80 to 100 if you just take care of them properly. Make sure they get the water, make sure, you prune when you need to, keep an eye on them for insect and disease problems, things like that. And if you just maintain them, it's like a nice classic automobile. You maintain it, you can keep it forever.
What is the yearly schedule or rotation of planting, getting the ground ready, planting the trees? What does that look like when you look at a full year?
Well, we like to have the planning for a good spring planting done in maybe September, October of the previous year. That way we can get, especially if you're getting cost share from the government, you want to give them the time that they need to get the paperwork done. But once we get all that signed, if you have it done in plenty of time, then we can start doing that preparation, because there's more work to this than most people realize. Especially if you have a renovation where you have an old windbreak and we're trying to renovate it to a newer status. You're going to have to take out trees. You're going to have to take out stumps. Those are not just the planted ones. Those are volunteers that may have gone in there. And if the thing's old enough, there may have been farm implements put in there, stuff like that, that all needs to be cleaned out. And that ground needs to be prepared several times until it's ready to go. And that is a time-consuming element. So we want to have the planning done September, October or so of the previous year. Then you've got to make sure, look at your plan, you know how many trees you need, and you've got to order your trees early on. Because ever since the pandemic, people have been ordering trees, because back in the pandemic, they were staying home and they're looking out the windows like there's nothing to do. Let's plant some trees, and they started buying them. Well, ever since then, we've been running out of trees early. So we start selling trees the day after New Year's. And within a few weeks, we can be sold out of certain species. So if you want to get your trees, you have your plan in place and you order your trees early. Now, they're not going to send them to you in January, because we don't expect people to be able to store them until March, properly without killing them. And so they will not ship your trees to you until March or April, when you're ready to put them in the ground. So you order them, then you wait, and then they will ship your trees to you. And they ship them UPS, so it's right to your door. Here's your trees, ready to go.
If people are wanting to establish a windbreak, what's the first person you recommend they reach out to?
If they're looking for cost share, I would go to your conservation district manager in your county. And if they can't do it, they will send you across the room to your NRCS people. And if they can't help you either, then they will still refer you to us at the Kansas Forest Service, and we can still draw up a plan for you, no problem, no charge.
John, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today.
That's no problem at all.
That was Kansas Forest Service Southwest Community and Rural District Forester John Klempa. I will link a publication titled Conservation Tree Planting Schedule in today's show notes on agtoday.net. We're cutting to a short break now, but we'll be right back.
Welcome back to Agriculture Today. Along with Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. We end today's program with this week's milk lines. Kansas dairy farmers are continuing to make progress in the dairy herds. Data from the Central Milk Marketing Order show Kansas dairy producers saw an all-time high in butterfat content in 2025, protein percentage increased, and somatic cell count in milk shipped continued to decrease. If producers are not seeing similar results, K-State dairy specialist Mike Brouk encourages them to visit with their nutritionist.
Today I'd like to visit with our Kansas dairy farmers concerning some wonderful progress that you've made in your dairy herds over the last 10 years. As we continue to analyze the data from 2025, the Milk Marketing Administrator in Kansas City has released some information concerning milk component values over the last 10 years, as well as how we did in 2025. In 2025, we saw an all-time high for butterfat test in our milk of 4.25% here in the Central Order. Over the past 10 years, the 10-year average is 3.97%, and it has been steadily rising each year, and particularly in the last 8 years, we've seen some tremendous increases in the butterfat content of the milk that we're shipping out of our herds. So, as you think about your dairy herd, where do you rank? If the average is 3.97, how does your herd look? Or, for 2025, the average was 4.25. Are you at the top of that range, or are you somewhere below that average? Somewhere below that average, there might be opportunities for you to increase your paycheck through increasing the values that you see in your milk components. Now, some of the things that might be involved there would be things like your genetics program, but also your feeding program, and as we approach summertime, what are you doing for heat abatement? If there's some improvements that can be made, you might want to be making those improvements soon because the heat is coming. As we look at the amount of protein that's in the milk that we're shipping, again, that has been on the increase as well, although at a much slower rate than what we've seen with butterfat. 10-year average for protein percent was 3.23%, and as we look at what the average was for 2025, we were just a little over 3.33%. So, how does your herd stack up? Are you ahead of the game? Are you average? Or are you below the average? If you're below the average, I suggest that you need to have a conversation with your nutritionist to see what you could maybe do from the standpoint of nutrition to see an increase in the protein percent in your herd. Much harder to increase protein percent in our shipped milk than what it is butterfat, but there are still some things that we might be able to tweak that would help us with that. Genetics also plays an important part of this, so depending on how you're using protein production in your genetics program may have an impact on this as well. In addition to looking at butterfat and protein, we always look at somatic cell, and somatic cell has showed a nice decreasing trend over the last 10 years. If we look back at 2015 compared to where we're at today, we see about a 14.6% reduction in the somatic cell count of our shipped milk. In fact, for 2025, we averaged under 200,000 average somatic cell on our shipped milk. Again, for your individual farm, take a look at where you stand compared to the average. If we look at the 10-year average, we're at 202,000 cells per mil for somatic cell count. Again, if you're below this line, great. If you're above the line, well, maybe there's room for improvement. You might have a conversation with your veterinarian as to things that you might be able to look at to decrease the somatic cell count in your herd. A lot of this has to do with the environment that we house our cows in. Could also have something to do with the types of bacteria that we might be dealing with in our herds. In order to reduce somatic cell count, sometimes there is some culling that's necessary, and consulting your veterinarian would be a good way to start to look at a plan to reduce somatic cell count in your herd. This is Mike Brouk with K-State Research and Extension.
Thanks, Mike. And that'll do it for this edition of Agriculture Today. For Shelby Varner, I'm Jeff Wickman. This is the K-State Radio Network.